Coming up on today's Locked On Bucks, we are officially 1 week away from Media Day, and with that, training camp. So we continue our look ahead to this upcoming season and shift our attention to the bench. Is the Bucks' second unit this year better than it was a season ago? Who is the sixth man, and who could we see take a big jump forward this season? We get into that conversation next on Locked On Bucks.
You are Locked On Bucks, your daily Milwaukee Bucks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome into Locked On Bucks. I'm Justin Garcia, joined as always by Camille Davis. We thank you for making Locked On Bucks your first listen of the day. We are free and available wherever you get your podcasts. You can also find us on YouTube. It's all part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's Locked On Bucks is brought to you by FanDuel. You can start the season with a big return on FanDuel. Place your first $5 bet and you'll get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. So it's the bench episode, Camille, taking a look at the second unit for the Bucks. I think the biggest question that we kind of tiptoed around earlier in the offseason, and I think it's the best place to start, is the sixth man. And Bobby Portis has admirably filled those shoes the last handful of years for the Bucks, in contention for sixth man of the year in each of the past two seasons. Really never challenged with that standing on the team either. But I do think you can make a strong case. No, there is a challenger for it this season that I'm not going into the season ready to concede. Bobby Portis is the sixth man. I think there's a real debate over who that's going to be. To me, it's one name specifically, but I'm curious your thoughts.
Yeah, I think just based on what Bobby has done the last 2 years, like, he gets a benefit of the doubt of being the sixth man for sure. I mean, last season was the first year in his career, if I remember correctly, where he played all 82 games. He finished third in sixth man of the year voting again for the second year in a row. And Bobby was consistent in the sense of just the points per game, the rebounds, what he does. And the thing with next year, like, I think DeLon Wright has an argument for it as well. But one thing with Bobby Portis, I saw this and was like, interesting, because once Doc Rivers took over at the end of January, Bobby Portis, his numbers went up under Doc. He averaged 15.5 points, 8.3 rebounds, 1.6 assists, and a steal while making 43.9% of his threes over the last 36 games of the season. He also recorded 10 of his 17 double-doubles down that stretch with Doc Rivers at the helm. So I do have a curiosity to see what Bobby's role is again. But I think that what DeLon Wright is bringing to the table is going to put him in contention as well for like sixth man of the year for this particular Bucks team. Because if you think about who he's replacing, Pat Bev averaged like 20 minutes a game for the Bucks while he was here. That's right in line with what DeLon has averaged. Well, he averaged last year with Miami, but I could see that ticking up as well this year with the Bucks, given the role that he was going to have as a perimeter point of attack defender for this team.
Yeah, DeLon Wright was the name that I was focusing on with this. And I think it's interesting because they both are going to, in theory, provide a lot of the same things, just at different spots, and that you're going to ask Bobby to take on multiple positions and kind of, okay, we need you to cover these two things. Is not a whole lot of depth in the front court for the Bucks, not a whole lot of depth at the point guard. And I suppose there's bodies, as we'll get into that conversation, on the wings, but it's not a ton of depth that you would look at and say established point guard depth and two guards too, that it's basically, DeLon, we need you to cover both of these. So that's going to be the interesting spot to see how you stagger the minutes for Bobby Portis in the front court and for DeLon Wright in the backcourt. The one area where I think you would nudge in the direction of DeLon Wright, if we're having a sixth man of the year conversation, is between the two. DeLon Wright, I think, has a much, much better chance to be an impactful player when it matters most for the Bucks and be somebody that's on the floor in those closing minutes.
Yeah, in large part because of that perimeter defense that he brings to the table. I mean, that's a great argument for him. And I also do wonder if he ends up being like the first sub off the bench more often than not because of the staggering of the minutes with Dame and just trying to get some relief with him coming in as a backup point guard, but also having the size to be a backup too as well for this team. So I think your point about what his role is going to be and what that might even mean for closing lineups is going to be really important because we could really see DeLon Wright closing games for the Bucks. And I see that as an option a bit more than I do as Bobby being somebody in the lineup to close. Now, we can always assume that Giannis is there, assuming health, of course, that Giannis is always going to be in that closing lineup for the Bucks. So then the question is, are the Bucks going, the normal with big, with Brooke out there? Are they going small in situations where it's Bobby as the nominal 5 on the floor in those situations? Or are you doing something where it's Giannis at the 5 and then you're just playing small around him with a Taurean Prince at the 4 or a Chris Middleton at the 4 and then playing off of that? So I do think it's really interesting to see how that will shake out and if those end of the game minutes start adding up to like who is the real 6 man for this Bucks team.
And here's the thing too is the last 2 years, DeLon Wright has played a total of 97 games. So up and down. I mean, early in his career, he didn't play a whole lot, a product of being a young player in Toronto during that run. But he did play the entire season. The year that the season was shortened due to COVID and we finished things in the bubble. He's been in the mid 70s a couple of times in his career, but on average, he's played 508 games, and we're talking about a 10-year career for him, roughly. So you're looking at 50 games on average per year that he's playing. That's the thing about Bobby Portis is, we've talked about a lot through the last year, and even before us, Kane and Frank and Eric had these conversations too. There's two sides of the coin, right? That we recognize some of the defensive shortcomings, some of the struggles that Bobby has had in the playoffs. But when you're talking about your bench, a lot of times that's your bridge to the postseason. We need to have these guys rested and ready to go. We need guys that we know we can rely on, and they'll be great 82 players, regular season performers. I don't want to diminish what Bobby Portis has done by he's going to be out there for 80 games a season and give you that consistency.
Yeah, you can count on Bobby for that. And I mean, over the last few years of him being in Milwaukee, he's been relatively healthy as well, which has been a big positive for this team, given the fact that they tend to be a little bit thin in that big rotation as it is. Like the big rotation for the Bucks is really just Giannis and Brooke and Bobby consistently. Now, we've talked a bit this offseason about, do the Bucks go more small more often? Do you see more Prince at the 4 sometimes to unlock Giannis at the 5? Do you see, Chris Middleton sliding up to the 4, so on and so forth going forward? But I think for Bobby and being able to play all of those games, just giving the rotation, you're going to continue to see that this year because the big rotation is the same again for the Bucks. It's still a thin rotation for the bigs for the Bucks. And on top of that, once you get to the playoffs, as the rotation shortens up, you're still going to need Bobby because of how thin that big rotation is. And the question just becomes, can he perform the way you need him to in the playoffs consistently? And we saw last year with Giannis out and him having to take a bigger role. I forget which game it was in the playoffs where he got ejected. And it's one of those moments where you're like, we really needed you in this game, just given how thin the Bucks have been. So I think for Bobby, it's always just around like, once we get to the playoffs, can you elevate your play in a way that is going to be meaningful for the team? Can the defense be there? Can the rebounding be there? Because we count on you for the scoring for sure. We know Bobby can get buckets. That's why they call him Bobby Buckets. But what more can he add to the game? Which is why, to your point about DeLon Wright, that defense isn't a question for him.
Game 4 against the Pacers, where he got ejected early. Yeah, on the heels of that game, you felt like you should have won, and you had the chance to win in Game 3, and then that happens. But yes, I mean, that's always the challenge with any type of harsh critique of Bobby Portis is it is very much slanted to the postseason because
Yep.
there is a significant amount of importance there. None of us are denying it, but you also can't fully discount and overlook just how productive and valuable he is to essentially know every single night Bobby Portis is going to be available, and every single night he's probably giving us a double-double and maybe even a 20-10 performance. So that is going to be one of the more interesting things to keep an eye on this upcoming season is who is the actual sixth man on this team? Is it going to be DeLon Wright, who we see coming off the bench first ahead of Bobby Portis and filling that role of Dame or Gary Trent Jr., assuming he's the starting two guard, and finding machinations that you can have him on the court in? Is it going to continue to be Bobby Portis? Leave your thoughts in the comments, and we'll see what the Bucks fans think about this one. It brings us to the rest of the bench and some other names to get into. Are the Bucks in a better spot than they were a season ago? We have some numbers that may really surprise you when we take a look at the bench performers from a season ago. We'll get into that conversation next on Locked On Bucks. Well, NFL fans, you can start the season with a big return on FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. So when you get a hunch in the middle of the game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you place your bets. You'll get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place your first $5 bet. That's FanDuel.com. Head over to FanDuel.com to get started. We thank all of you for making Locked On Bucks your first listen of the day. For your second listen, we encourage you to check out the Locked On NBA podcast. Get the mix of national and local perspective in 30 minutes or less. We know there's no offseason in the league, and the very brief offseason we do have is coming to an end now. No one keeps you as informed or entertained as Locked On NBA. Available on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day. Well, the bench from a year ago, Camille, we were talking before we started to record this, and I said, look, I just want to look back at some of these numbers with the second unit and see where do the Bucks check in with their bench performance a season ago. I'm going to start with the individual player outlook for this second unit for the Bucks, and it should be no surprise. We've already mentioned the name, but the guy that played the most games for the Bucks second unit last year, and it's been habitual the last few years, that is Bobby Portis, leading the team there with 78 games played. He had the 4 starts, but 78 bench appearances for Bobby Portis. The player that checked into games the second most frequently from the second unit for the Bucks, with 73 games played off the bench, was none other than Pat Connaughton. And Camille, I'm going to submit this for reasons why the Bucks bench will be better this season than it was a year ago. 1 through 5 in games played for that second unit a year ago. Bobby Portis, we touched on. Pat Connaughton, number 2. AJ Green played the third most games off the bench for the Bucks. Let that sink in. AJ Green was your number 3 bench performer in terms of games played from a season ago. Then Andre Jackson, and then Marjon Beauchamp. Not a very inspiring group that you had there. We obviously saw some strides from AJ Green. We talked about the consistency that Bobby Portis brings you. Andre Jackson, the offense is still very much a work in progress. Right. We saw that and a lot of fouls last year. But in the case of Pat Connaughton and Marjon, I don't know really how to sum up and classify what we saw a season ago. So it didn't – the bench fell short in 2 areas. Number one, you either have to be a very good scoring bench, and I think we've talked about this a couple of times. The Bucks are just not going to be in that group because you're getting scoring from your starting 5. If you have a high-scoring bench, usually means you're not a good team and your starters aren't all that good. So we're not going to see that for some time. But the second piece of it is what we saw a lot in Mike Budenholzer's tenure, especially early, and that is the specialists. Whether it's, hey, we got a guy that can knock down shots and we got a bunch of defensive guys, or we got a guy that can run the offense. Just do your job to borrow from Bill Belichick, and we're going to give you the lead. Don't surrender the lead.
Yeah.
The Bucks did a good job of that the first 2-3 years under Bud, and it slowly shifted away from that. They did not do that last year. So as we kind of said, you got to be one or the other. They were neither of them. And I don't think anybody would profess, hey, this was a good bench a season ago. It was not. And I think those games played are really jarring when you look at the players that we're talking about.
I don't know how many people would have guessed that AJ Green was third most, games off of the bench for the Milwaukee Bucks last season. But I mean, I think of a lot of different post-game shows that I did with Frank, and one of the things that would come up is just like the bench scoring. And it's like, wow, the Bucks bench was outscored heavily in this particular game. And we would talk about it, like you mentioned, where it's like, we're not expecting the Bucks bench to come in and be one of the top scoring benches. That's not what we're asking them to do. We're just asking you not to blow the lead when you're here. Like, I went on StatMuse really quick just to see who the top bench scoring team was in the league last year. And according to StatMuse, it was the Pacers, and they had 46.8 points coming off their bench. Yep. Just if you were curious where the Bucks fell, they were 19th with 32.5. And as we have mentioned, a lot of those points came from Bobby Portis. So that's not necessarily what I'm looking for this bench to do. I'm not necessarily counting on the Bucks bench to come in and just light everybody up. But what is interesting to me is how the bench minutes will be staggered with some of the starters this year. So, for example, Gary Trent led bench unit. What does that look like for the Bucks? Like, that's a starter in the game who we're assuming is a starter, Gary Trent. But what does his scoring do to boost the numbers when it's mostly bench players on the court with him? What does AJ Green look like in year 3 coming off the bench for the Bucks, if that is going to be a bigger role for him? In addition to that, we have the new vets on the bench as well for the Bucks with Taurean Prince. We mentioned DeLon Wright already. So it's going to be interesting to see how this shakes out for the Bucks. And honestly, who from last year's squad might lose minutes to accommodate some of these other guys getting new minutes fresh, or certain guys like an AJ Green or an Andre Jackson Jr. getting more minutes off of the bench.
Yeah. And if we even just look at net rating, I know it's not the cleanest view, but net rating for benches, Bucks ranked 20th last season.
It's tough.
Yeah. And the Pacers, they scored a lot. They had the 8th best net rating. Their defense, was it great? No, but their offense was very, very good. The Bucks, again, they didn't do either of the two. Mm-hmm. So I don't anticipate this to be a scoring juggernaut of a second unit. But again, when you look at some of those names that we assume are going to be coming off of the bench, in DeLon Wright, in Taurean Prince, in what we've talked about, the possibilities that you have with somebody like Andre Jackson Jr. Hey, even if our guy and the number one son on the pod, Chris Livingston, finds a way to make his mark, and the defensive opportunities you have there, I do think that's a major opportunity. I do think, just looking at, again, the names we gave you in terms of who logged the most minutes in games off the bench for the Bucks a season ago and what they did. Pat Connaughton, second most games played, more than 20 minutes per game. If we just broke it down by minutes per game off the bench, Bobby Portis, number 1 at 24. Pat Connaughton and Jay Crowder each played 21 and a half minutes off the bench. Cam Payne played 14 minutes. So those were a lot of the issues. Cam Payne did a very good job of running the offense and getting things organized. You had defensive issues all across the board, and Cam Payne didn't help that. So taking all of that into account, I do believe this is going to be a much, much better bench for the Bucks than it was a season ago, if for no other reason than what we've touched on before. If we start with the beginning of the season, regardless of how much he may have regressed, and what Lakers fans will tell you at this point in their careers, Taurean Prince is an upgrade over Jay Crowder, and he is a defensive upgrade over Jay Crowder. The same for DeLon Wright when we talk about those campaign minutes. And I'll go as far as saying DeLon Wright is an upgrade over Pat Beverly as well on both ends of the floor. So those are two big pieces. DeLon Wright, we think, is going to cover a lot in the backcourt. Point guard minutes, 2 guard minutes. We talked about AJ Green. The fact that he was already a regular in the rotation from a year ago, that role is I don't know if it's going to expand because of the Gary Trent Jr. addition, but I don't think it's going to be reduced there. So I do feel like they're in a much better spot than they were a season ago, if for no other reason than what we've kind of stressed all throughout the offseason, and that is the individual upgrades they've made to this roster.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with that. And the Jay Crowder piece is interesting as well because we know he fell out of the rotation later on in the season. He had the injury. He started the season off scorching hot from three, really helped them. He had that injury. He was out for a while. And once he came back, he just never seemed to really regain that mojo, which I didn't expect because the clip that he was shooting at from three to start the season was ridiculous and unsustainable. So it wasn't realistic to expect that, but just didn't expect it to tank as much as it did when he came back. And on top of that too, Jay Crowder was a guy who the Bucks would use for spot starts as well. Yep. Like he played 50 games for the Bucks, and I believe half of them, 25, he started. So it was like he had a lot of minutes as well coming as a spot starter for the Bucks in order to not necessarily, I don't say mess up the rotation, but kind of mess up the rotation off the bench with a Bobby Portis, with a Pat Connaughton. You didn't see them start as much. And I do wonder this upcoming season that we're getting ready to embark on, does Pat Connaughton, he played what, 22 minutes a game last year?
Yeah.
Does he surpass that mark this season?
I didn't know we were going to take it in that direction, but that is certainly an interesting conversation to have. So I want to get into that and a little bit more of the breakdown of what we anticipate to be this rotation for bench options. And again, where would this stack up if this is the rotation against other teams in the entire league? So we'll get into that conversation coming up next here on Locked On Bucks. Passion, drive, and patience. That is the formula for winning championships, and that's also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. Superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has you covered. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time or your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to make your car the MVP and bring home huge wins. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. eBay Guaranteed Fit only available to U.S. customers. All right, so does Pat Connaughton play more than the 22 minutes per game this season opposed to last year? So the 22 minutes per game.
And as you think about that too, just like I pulled up his numbers. So like the 22 minutes that Pat Connaughton played for the Bucks this year was the least amount that he's played since his second year in Milwaukee. Yes. So just looking back, he played 20.7, 18.6, 22.8, 26 minutes, 23.7, and then 22.1 this year. So he's hovered around that 20 mark, but like as we saw in the 2021-22 season, 26 minutes a game for Pat Connaughton, it was getting up there. So like this upcoming season, do you see the trend continuing with him being around 22, or is it going to be less?
Well, I mean, you asked it, so I'm assuming you think he is going to play in that same range or more.
I think he's going to go a little bit down. I think it's going to be around 19. It'll be close. I don't think it's going to drop considerably for Pat Connaughton, but I could see it being around like the 18, 19, maybe 20 minutes per game for Pat.
So I think we've touched on this a little bit on some shows throughout the summer here, but the interesting piece of it is the makeup of this group. So I don't want to blow things out of proportion and say, man, they're loaded on the wing. In terms of body count, they are loaded on the wing.
Yeah.
Are these blossoming superstars, and do they have, man, this is the exact type of makeup of a roster you'd want? No, not necessarily. But the point is, they have more options now than they have really, from what I can remember, ever before in that spot. Doesn't make it a good option. It just means you have options to throw out there. But if we look at where Pat Connaughton is slotted in the most, at small forward and 2 guard, one of the other things, just to get it out of the way, that we talked about a little bit too when we were thinking, this player slot in there? We wondered about AJ Green at the 3, and do they think it's interchangeable and you could play 2 guards and AJ Green together? It happened for 9 possessions last year. So we saw it in 1 game for a couple of stretches, but it's not to say that's not an option this year. But for this practice, we didn't include AJ Green in the small forward discussion. So 2 guard, we're assuming Gary Trent Jr. is starting. We assume the top backup for 2 guard is DeLon Wright. So I think we both assume power forward and center, Bobby Portis is your backup. Point guard and 2 guard, DeLon Wright is your backup. But after DeLon, AJ Green, and the growth and progression that you saw from him a season ago, that's not going to stop. Pat Connaughton is going to see some minutes there, but you also have Andre Jackson Jr. Again, if the offense can start to make some strides and those fouls come down, he's certainly somebody that could steal a lot of those minutes and options from Pat Connaughton. MarJon, you have to throw in there as well, but I think it's pretty clear Pat Connaughton's in front of MarJon Beauchamp, and he's, as much as Bucks fans may not want to hear it, he's in front of Andre Jackson Jr. As well. At small forward, though, Chris Middleton starting. We assume Taurean Prince is the primary backup there and power forward that he'll see minutes. Pat Connaughton, another spot where he's going to get some of those looks. Andre Jackson Jr., we've seen play there. He's an option. Chris Livingston could be an option there as well. MarJon Beauchamp, if it's, hey, MarJon's figured it out and things are trending upwards, maybe he's going to be an early season option. And of course, Stanley Umude, who we did not see in Summer League, but showed some, I don't want to sell it too much, but showed some flashes with a very, very bad Pistons team a year ago. But just like we talked about with Chris Livingston, you look at him and you say, this guy fits the mold of what we're looking for, and he's a better shooter than Chris Livingston. So there's a lot of bodies to throw out there. If we go back a year ago and look at how this was structured, I don't think there was as many roadblocks in the way for Pat Connaughton. And that's also, excluding the, oh, by the way, performance-wise, it wasn't what you needed to see from Pat Connaughton. So that's going to be the big thing, is as much as Bucks fans and everybody else likes to really harp on Doc Rivers if he doesn't play young guys, and ignoring that 80% of coaches in the league don't play their young guys. If we see more of that carryover, you have more options this year. And that's when it's going to get fascinating, is if we're a month plus into the season and Pat Connaughton's shooting in the low 30s or worse from 3, and you're just not seeing the guy that you saw 2 years ago. And you say, look, all these names that we listed, we have them we can turn to. Maybe I look at Andre and I say, get out there for a couple of minutes. You like what you see, because we saw that for a couple of times last year where, oh, that looked pretty good. Here's the next 3 games. This guy's in the rotation. And with the amount of guys that are in front of you, if you have that start to happen more and more, you're just kind of lost. So I guess to answer your question, I think those minutes played for Pat Connaughton are going to be up there early, but I do think it's going to taper off. Even if Pat Connaughton has the bounce back season that we hope for, he's another one of those guys that you say, look, we've seen him have some moments in the playoffs. We'd like this in the postseason. So let's continue to build our young guys, develop those guys, get them those reps, sprinkle in vets with the young guys. But maybe it means we can take our foot off the gas with Pat. We like what we see. We can drop that minute total down to 16.
Yeah, the question, as we were having a conversation, it just kind of popped in my head. So I was like, let me just throw this question out there. And I love that I did, because I think that's a really thoughtful response to it. And what you got at is part of why when we did our episodes around players that could have a regression, players that can have a breakout, part of why I had Pat Connaughton as a candidate for regression wasn't even all on Pat's shoulders, but more so about how many options that the Bucks have to fill up the minutes that he generally took. And to your point about the 3-point shooting, when it comes to Pat Connaughton, if he has another year where he's sub 35% from 3, what does that look like for the Bucks? And as we've seen, as it appeared, I'll say last year, the athleticism it was starting to wane a bit for Pat Connaughton. Him doing the little things that you gotten so used to him doing was waning a little bit. Like the cuts are there, yes, for sure, but like the rebounding, just the little things that Pat Connaughton has done. And as we mentioned, like during that championship run, there were even times where the Bucks would have him out there as a nominal 4 in very small minutes, of course. But like that was the trust in Pat Connaughton in his game to make the right decisions, to knock down shots when he was open. So I am really curious to see what this season brings. And I do think I agree with you in the point of I could see Pat getting the nod early. As a vet, you know, you earn your spot. And if a young guy can knock you off of it, then he does. But like I'm going to give you the benefit of the doubt going forward. So it'll be really interesting to see how that plays out for the Bucks and the bench rotation.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I don't know. It's tough to say where the Bucks going to finish because there's so many metrics that you can throw out there when you're rating benches and productivity from that bench. Look, I do think they're going to be far improved from where they were a season ago, and I think the best place to really look at that is the net rating for the bench, where we said they ranked 20th. I'll go as far as saying this. If the Bucks have the 20th rated bench in the league again this season, I don't think the defense is fixed and better, and I don't think they're going to be more than a 47 to 49 win team again and kind of stuck in that same spot. So it's important as guys like Giannis and Dame and Chris Middleton obviously are for this group, the bench, the older that you get. And as we talk about preserving guys for the postseason, again, it doesn't necessarily mean if we sit this guy X amount of games, he's going to be healthy in the playoffs. But being able to get through that stretch, your bench is what helps you do that. Your bench is what can help you avoid a 5, 6, 7 game losing streak and things of that nature, or losing 7 out of your last 10 games. Improved bench play is one way to get there because it just takes so much off of the starting 5 where you know it's all on us because as soon as we go to the bench,
can't count on nobody.
Can't count on it, and we can't count as that lead to be preserved. So I do think, and it sounds like you agree. I do think it's going to be much improved, the bench from where it was a season ago. And again, you have a lot more options. It doesn't mean we're saying this team is absolutely loaded. There's some questions, and there's some uncertainty, and there's some guys that I think could really surprise, and you could find something and say, "Wow." Going back to before the season started, who would have thought player X was going to be the guy that played the 3rd most minutes off the bench and did this? Because, again, Camille, leaving that season and going through and consuming everything that we did a season ago, it still really shocked me to see 2 and 3 in terms of games played and then up there in minutes as well were Pat Connaughton and AJ Green. So it's going to be a fascinating thing to keep tabs on this season.
It really is. And I mean, we've seen role players and bench players swing a playoff series. You got to have a game. Yeah. A game can really change things. I mean, we had a Pat Beverly game in the playoffs against the Pacers where it was like, didn't expect that coming, especially with no Dame, no Giannis. And it was a game where it was like everyone else stepped up in that moment. Again, you don't want to be in a situation as the Bucks where you're without Dame or Giannis. Like that's not a winning formula for them at all. But if they're all on the court together, like we've had role player game. We had the Forbes game when they won a championship where it's like he got hot from 3 in this game and then helped boost them. So like to be able to get production from your bench consistently through the regular season helps, but then also in the playoffs when that rotation shortens, if guys can step up in the moment and knock down their shots in a timely manner, be assignment sure, play defense, do all the little things, like it can go a long way, which is why the bench is so important and why I also do agree with you and thinking on paper the Bucks bench this year looks like it should be improved over what was on the court for them last year.
And the last things I would point out is we mentioned the DeLon Wright thing of, okay, he's averaged, this amount of games. If we remove the first 4 years of his career in Toronto, where he was kind of lost in the shuffle for most of those portions, he's averaged about 57 games per season that he's played in. No, not terrible. With Taurean Prince as well, he's been a guy kind of similar to Bobby Portis in some ways that you look at and you see some years where he's had a lot of starts and then other years where it's kind of split between a starter and a bench guy. And with the Timberwolves, that was a role that he really excelled at, coming off the bench and really helping that second unit. Again, I think go back 2 years ago in that Timberwolves theme, that's a comp I I think you could look for the Bucks and what they hope to do with their second units this year. So we've seen Taurean Prince fill that. We've seen Bobby Portis fill it. We saw AJ Green fill that role admirably as well. And I think the big part is just finding more of those young guys to continue their growth and unearth something, whether or not that's Andre Jackson Jr. making a leap. Maybe it's our guy, Chris Livingston, breaking on through something, but you have to get that consistency. And I think the big piece is at least one player has to take a step forward. We touched on the importance of Dame's bounce back, the consistency of Giannis, etc. But with that bench, I do think you need one of those guys that we've gone through to start to make a leap and give you something you didn't necessarily anticipate. We didn't mention AJ Johnson or Tyler Smith in this. Look, I suppose I'll say this, and I know a lot of Bucks fans, we've seen it in the comments here as well from the everydayers, are very high on AJ Johnson. Hard not to be after we saw what we did in Summer League. So that last point I made of somebody you didn't expect, of, whoa, this guy made a leap and that really helped them. AJ Johnson would be the one that would make the most sense. I just can't quite get there yet for all the age, everything else, the roadblocks in front of him, and Doc Rivers doesn't play young guys. I can't get there yet, but I'll say this. I would be surprised. I wouldn't be totally floored if that were the case of, whoa, this guy had a stretch of X amount of games where he really showed us something.
Yeah, I mean, during the press conference when AJ and Tyler are being introduced to the city, they mentioned like, what we're trying to do is get better as quick as we can so that we can earn the minutes to get onto the floor, because they come in and understanding like, we're not going to walk into minutes in this situation here in Milwaukee. We're going to have to earn everything here. The guard rotation behind the Bucks, it's a thinner rotation for guards alone, which would give AJ Johnson, somebody, a chance for at least a few minutes. And I think if we see AJ Johnson consistently in the season, that means that those flashes we saw in Summer League were more consistent in training camp. They've been more consistent in practice behind the scenes. And we don't want it to be like the end of Summer League for AJ Johnson, where it's just a brick fest and things aren't working for him. But again, you see the flashes in his game. So I would hope that he can sneak in, 5-6 minutes every so often, just to kind of get the reps in and see how that goes. But if he is playing in a consistent way in the rotation, he has far surpassed what I thought that he'd be able to do in his rookie year for sure.
Well, and, in closing, the biggest impact that duo may bring is behind the scenes in practices. Because, I mean, that's what you're going to have to go against. We saw it in the Pacers series. It's not like the Pacers are the only team that plays at an up-tempo pace and gets up and down the floor. So you need to better prepare yourself against that. And I would assume you're going to see a lot of AJ Johnson, Tyler Smith, and all those young guys that we mentioned filling that role. It was basically Ajax last year that had to be the guy that was the Energizer Bunny in practices. And now you have more of those guys to really push your vets. And it's not, hey, figure out how to get faster, because like, if there is a way to do that, I think we're all ears on that. But it's more of, how do we deal with this? How do we defend this in building up those reps? And again, you can't quantify it, but that may be the biggest impact that we see from those young guys. And that's not dismissing what they would bring if that were the case. We thank you again for making Locked On Bucks your first listen today. For that second listen, again, go check out the Locked On NBA podcast. You get local experts. You're updated daily on all the biggest storylines, as we're now a week away from the season actually being here, the start of the NBA season. Not games yet, but training camps and everything else. Find Locked On NBA on YouTube, wherever you listen to your podcast. We have the link in today's episode description as well, so you can jump to it directly from there. That'll do it for today's show. Leave your thoughts on the bench. Is it going to be better than it was a season ago? Who do you think is the biggest X factor on that second unit? And who's going to be the sixth man? Leave your thoughts. Camille and I will get to those in the comments and address them on future shows as well. For Camille, I'm Justin. We will talk to you once again tomorrow on Locked On Bucks.